So Rebecca, you had done the confirmation for Kristen Sultan, is that right?
Yes.
And someone had mentioned that maybe her name didn't appear in the calendar. I just wanted to check. Anyway, we can talk about
Yeah, there were two in the calendar.
I mentioned I can't share my screen, so Julie might not be able to hear it.
that. Was it? Okay,
I got
that could be wrong.
Yeah.
I cannot share my screen yet. There's a person secretary one that may not have sharing.
Karen Hale, one, Karen Hale wasn't in the register.
I sent it to her.
Back.
Oh, but I was just letting you know that
So we
when I
could
go to share, it says it.
But I checked out all.
It says you,
Yeah, okay.
oh,
Yeah.
that's because.
Okay. FYI, we do have another couple people that need to get assigned as appointments. And I feel like
You get that now?
Yes, thank you for that.
maybe it's just the one.
Yeah, I've got a pretty good system right now. That
Oh,
it's
great.
done really fast.
Oh, amazing. Thank you. That's great. That's fabulous. Okay, so it's just that one that we need to do. Super. How are you?
In the meeting,
You're in the meeting. That's progress.
yes.
Fantastic. Do you need me to stall?
No, I'm good now.
Okay, fantastic. All right, so this is just for context, everybody, this is yeah, just us, an opportunity for us to get to know the climate council and to hear about what they are up to and just a little bit of one-on-one on this, just so that, I mean, we have heard from them in the past with that joint hearing with transportation, but I think it's always good to just have a little bit of, so welcome.
Thank you.
Yes.
For the record, Julie Moore, I'm the Secretary of Natural Resources, and I'm joined this morning by Jane Zorchak, who heads our Climate Action Office. She's going to talk about the work they are doing to support the Climate Council as we are building the Climate Action Plan 2.0. But I thought before jumping into that, it would be important to talk a little bit about sort of what the work within A&R is, and then what the work is within the Climate Council itself. So I'm going to start with this overview of our Climate Action Office. Including talking a little bit about the formation of it, what our staff looks like within that team, the specific bodies of work that they are engaged in, and then try to create a little bit of a diagram that hopefully helps show where that division of labor occurs between the Climate Office and the Climate Council. So I've got all kinds of things over my screen that I'll forget. So when the Global Warming Solutions Act was passed by the legislature in 2020, it did include 2 new positions and some funding for legal services within A&R to support implementation of the Global Warming Solutions Act, including the initial Climate Action Plan. As you may recall, the Global Warming Solutions Act was placed into law in September of 2020, and our initial Climate Action Plan was due December 1st of 2021. So it was absolutely a sprint for those 15 months to prepare that initial plan, and our 2 positions were dedicated almost full-time to supporting the effort to get that plan up and ready for adoption. As we moved past that initial surge of work in the governor's FY23 budget, he proposed the creation of a Climate Action Office at A&R. The Climate Action Office has 7 staff in addition to Jane. Some of these were existing positions within our air quality division in DEC, who had really been responsible for tracking greenhouse gas emissions, preparing that annual inventory. But several of these positions are new and were created to sort of match the scope of what was envisioned by the Global Warming Solutions Act. So you can see that we have folks working on mitigation, which is greenhouse gases. We have folks working on resilience. We have folks working on community engagement. And so it is a broad suite of activities that the agency is charged with being responsible for. So I'm going to step through those with a little bit more detail and just give you a sense for how this team spends their days. I would say the first area of focus is greenhouse gas mitigation. And so the team includes folks who are with expertise in modeling. We also contract for some of that work. But I want to make sure we're both driving the work to model the scenarios we're most interested in and reviewing the work to make sure it matches our expectations. We also have folks that are engaged in policy evaluation. The cap and invest assessment that formed the basis for the recommendations delivered by the treasurer last month was led by a team in A&R alongside our partners at V-Trans. We've been doing work looking at life cycle greenhouse gas emissions, agricultural greenhouse gas emissions. And I think Jane will talk about those in a little bit more detail, sort of some of the open technical bodies of work that they are engaged in. The Climate Office also has responsibilities around programmatic work. So the rulemaking, if there are recommendations in the climate plan that drive us to rulemaking, that takes place through that team. And then they're also contracting for some direct implementation activities on the ground, including, for example, a refrigerant management program that BEIC is the lead on, helping folks swap out refrigerants with high global warming potential for more earth-friendly options. The second big area of work is around resilience. You may have heard earlier this week, Jane's team led an incredible stakeholder workshop as we are building towards a resilience implementation strategy. This was work the governor and the treasurer had committed to last January. We are on track to deliver this on July 1st of this year. And it's really, sort of focused on the fact that there were a lot of big ideas contained in our initial climate action plan and the chapters around rural resilience and agriculture and ecosystems, but they were really challenging to translate into specific actions on the ground that would fall under the umbrella of state government. And so what the team has been doing in this space is looking at all of the existing programs within state government that have a nexus to improving our resilience in the face of a changing climate, identifying gaps and prioritizing them. And then the treasurer's team will be working with us on how to best fill those gaps. We'll bring the technical expertise and they will bring the financial expertise. And we're sort of in those arrows along the bottom, kind of in the third and fourth arrow right now, where we're really in that deep stakeholder and community engagement phase, making sure we haven't missed anything and what they see as the gaps and how best to prioritize them. The team also is responsible for tracking progress. Probably the highest profile piece of that is the greenhouse gas inventory that we publish each year. In part because that is the basis for determining whether or not we have achieved the greenhouse gas emissions reductions required by the Global Warming Solutions Act. In addition, we are in the early stages of developing what we're calling the Measuring and Assessing Progress tool. So the greenhouse gas inventory is largely a modeling exercise that takes into account both state generated data sets as well as some data sets that we receive from EPA and other national partners that with information downscale to Vermont. This Measuring and Assessing Progress tool is going to be looking at Vermont specific activities, how much of different things we are accomplishing on the ground, and as well as adaptation actions in addition to those greenhouse gas emissions reductions. The Global Warming Solutions Act also placed a heavy emphasis on community engagement, environmental justice, and a just transition. And so we have had a very heavy emphasis on community engagement. We are routinely both standing up events to receive input and feedback from Vermonters, but perhaps more importantly, going to events that were already planned with information about the climate-related initiatives that the agency is engaged in, soliciting feedback, ideas, concerns. And if you get into this presentation and click on that link, Jane's team puts together a quarterly summary of what they are hearing from the public. This is just, I think, a link to one of those summaries, but I encourage you to spend some time with them. They're really valuable in hearing from a whole diversity of community members about what they see as important, what their concerns are, and frankly, what policies they think, sort of companion policies they think are necessary for our climate work to be successful. There's also an interagency coordination function. This one's truly inside baseball, but is important, which is we didn't have that kind of hub for climate activity across state government. So Jane has convened an interagency advisory board, and the idea there is to make sure we have a full understanding of what each other are doing, whether it's the work around electric vehicles and electric vehicle charging infrastructure being led by V-Trans and ACCD, the work being done by the Department of Public Service in terms of electric panel upgrades, some weatherization work, their oversight of Efficiency Vermont, and the Office of Economic Opportunity within the Department of Children and Families, where most of our low-income weatherization work is led out of. So aligning those efforts, and then again, this ability to look at gaps and needs, and track progress over time. And this board, I believe, meets quarterly, Jane. So I think everyone involved has found real value in having that sort of opportunity for discussion and coordination. And then I think this is the way I've organized this. The last one of the sort of tasks of the Climate Office is providing support to the Climate Council. So probably first and foremost, it's managing contractual services. The Climate Council will ask questions or identify needs. To the extent we have budget available, we work sort of in a prioritized fashion to do the technical analysis and other studies necessary to inform the Climate Council's work on the Climate Action Plan. Probably the best example of this is our contract with the Stockholm Environmental Institute that is helping us look at different climate scenarios and understand the impact policies would have in out years on our overall greenhouse gas emissions. We also provide administrative assistance to the council. All council meetings and subcommittee meetings are warned in our public meetings. We have Teams links broadly available to the public that would like to participate in them. And so there is quite a bit of administrative capacity that's required to support that work. And Jane will talk a little bit about the magnitude of what's going on there. And then we are providing support to the Climate Action Plan process. Climate counselors themselves this year are the ones picking up the pens to do a lot of the writing. But again, we are providing administrative support, templates, keeping folks on schedule, gathering those different work products, assembling them and distributing them back out to the council for review and comment. So that's a very time-consuming piece of the work at the moment as we are building towards that July 1st, 25 deliverable. And then was just sort of looking at a way to try to show how the responsibilities of the Climate Action Office and the responsibilities of the Climate Council kind of lay out, and trying to show who's the lead on what. So interagency coordination is kind of a no-brainer. There isn't really a Climate Council role in that. That is something within state government. The climate plan is largely the responsibility of the Climate Council to draft and develop, but certainly those coordinating functions I just described sit within the Climate Action Office. I would say our key shared responsibility is around community outreach and public engagement. Counselors are encouraged to participate in many of these events. I myself had the opportunity to join a meeting that was arranged in Winooski with New American Communities to hear from them about what their concerns were, and found it really insightful. And the office has arranged a set of seven public meetings over the next month, where we will be talking about the draft of the Climate Action Plan and hearing feedback from the community. I hope this is helpful to you too, but I was just trying to look for a way to sort of organize that overall body of work and show which are shared responsibilities, which kind of sit fully with the Climate Office, and which are more biased towards the Climate Council itself. And this last slide is just for reference, and probably a nice opportunity for me to sort of turn the talking stick over to Secretary Clark. But this is the current membership of the Climate Council. Would be remiss if I didn't note for you all that there is a vacant position that the Senate is responsible for filling, which is our Community Action Partnerships position. This is up until now been filled by 2 different representatives from Capstone Community Action, but is currently vacant and has been since the start of the year. Obviously, this is an important voice for the needs and concerns of low-income Vermonters, and just would urge you to do what you can to see that seat filled. The 5 folks shown on this chart with asterisks after their names are members of the steering committee. So we have this much smaller group, 2 members of the administration, 2 Senate appointed members, 2 House appointed members. The second House appointed member had been Brent Kleppner before he was elected to the House. He was in that seat representing Vermont manufacturers, and that hasn't been refilled. So right now we have a 5-person steering committee. We meet generally to set the agendas for the full council meeting, as well as look at more time-sensitive matters that may need council input. And I think it's been a pretty successful model. As you might imagine, convening 23 people is a lot. Convening 6 people is much more realistic. And with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Sarah Clark. As for the Global Warming Solutions Act, she is the chair of the Climate Council. And let her introduce herself and just say a few words.
Super, thank you.
You're welcome. I'm gonna stop sharing this screen and get out of the seat.
Thank you, Secretary Moore. Good
Morning, welcome.
I'm Sarah Clark, the Secretary of Administration. I was saying earlier, I think this is the first time in my more than 20 years in state government that I've been in this committee, which is crazy for me because I worked at Forest Parks and Recreation for a number of years, but
Well,
thank you for having me. As Secretary Moore indicated, I am the chair of the Climate Council. I think when you look at the statute, the Global Warming Solutions Act, it is the only secretary that does not have a designee on the council. And so I have been trying to quickly get up to speed on the work of the council and the issue in general. I think you're aware, I was formally appointed by the governor and I was actually just confirmed, I think last Friday. So thank you for that. Very exciting for me personally. But I became appointed the secretary full-time in November. Prior to that, starting in May, I was interim secretary, but really serving the function of secretary of the Agency of Administration and deputy secretary. So I didn't fully step into the role of chair of the Climate Council until November, which I have come to understand we're in this really critical time period, building when I joined in November, but on which feels like a very fast track to submit the update to the climate action plan for July 1st. And so I'm very thankful for my colleagues that have spent quite a bit of time bringing me up to speed on the work of the council and the issue in general, because I'm not a climate expert, but I'm learning. And so I engage as the chair of the council with the committee and actively participate. It's really a working council. And we have a very detailed agenda set forth for as we head towards July to be able to submit the updated climate action plan. So that's what I was prepared to say today.
Super, any questions? Yes.
Me too.
I was not involved in the details of creating the Global Warming Solutions Act and the council. I didn't know actually that the Secretary of Administration was the chair. I assumed, I think, that the Secretary of A&R was the chair. So does that work? Like, and what, do you know why? I mean, was it just to have sort of a outside, a non-expert voice being the chair? Maybe that's valuable, or I'd just love your perspective.
Yeah, maybe, and I also wasn't engaged when the bill came to be, and so maybe I can share my thoughts, and Secretary Moore may have some. And I think the role that I try to play, being new, but my role on the council is more of an administrative one and understanding administrative processes in state government. For example, the rulemaking process and bringing that voice to the table. I think Secretary Young, Suzanne Young, was the first chair of the Climate Council. She was Secretary of Administration, and then Secretary Clauser as well. My understanding is played a very similar role. I'm very thankful to Secretary Moore for the expertise that she brings to the table and the team, the Climate Office, bringing to the Climate Council itself. But that's kind of my viewpoint of why it is. I will say, I think one of the proposals that we brought to the legislature this year would change the makeup of the council, including the Secretary of Administration would not be on the council.
At all, it wouldn't be on the council at all,
Correct.
and who would chair it in that proposal?
Secretary Moore.
Okay. So, I mean, I wonder. I guess I could see value in having somebody who is sort of an outsider be the chair and try to hold everybody accountable for their. But it is a little interesting, because it did not. Yes, go ahead.
So just would add, I mean, I think there's another facet to sort of the challenging position of having the Secretary of Administration chair the council, which is there are 15 legislatively appointed members and 8 administration members. And so to the extent there's disagreement between the legislative and administrative branches, we have a chair that isn't in the majority party, which means it really does become very much what Sarah says, this kind of process related role as opposed to what you might think of as a traditional chair role, where you don't have that same degree of necessarily buy-in and support in terms of the direction that's being set. So it really does become that process focus as opposed to more leadership role. And again, that's reflected in the governor's proposal that's in H 289, which would have I think 10 administration appointed members, 9 legislatively appointed members, and then have the Secretary of Natural Resources serve as the chair of that council.
Interesting. And are you on track to meet that deadline with the next report?
Yes, we are, and I'll tell you, this is as a newbie coming to the group, the amount of work that gets accomplished by this team, both at council meetings and then outside of it is really commendable.
Yes.
And the weekend reading assignments, I would say.
Yeah, we're familiar with that.
Yeah.
Thank you. Any other questions? Well, thank you, yeah. Good to have you in here. And welcome, Janie.
Okay.
Yes.
James Orchak, I lead the climate action office within the Agency of Natural Resources. Thanks for inviting me to your class. I am going to focus my remarks today on the component of the climate action plan and the sort of strength that it brings to bear as required by the Global Warming Solutions Act. I'm going to focus a bit on the creation of the initial plan and the core policy outcomes within the 3 buckets of work from that initial plan, and speak to what has moved forward and what hasn't. And then signal to the process that we're working to update that plan by July 1st, and so leave some space for you to invite other counselors in if you'd like to learn sort of about the core policy recommendations being considered within that plan. So Secretary Moore, some of my comments will overlap with Secretary Moore's, but I'll go into a bit more details about the history of both the Climate Council and then again the objectives and sequence of work around the development of the Climate Action Plan. But the Global Warming Solutions Act was passed in September of 2020. Due to the pandemic, the passage of that law lagged for about 6 months. And I mention that only because the timelines set forth within the Global Warming Solutions Act were pretty aggressive in service of developing that initial plan, but then also we lost 6 months in putting forward the work of that body of work for that initial plan. So it was sort of extra rushed. So as Secretary Moore alluded to, I came on board in January of 2021, and we hired another staff member that spring, Marion Wolves, who now leads our resilience and adaptation work. But the 2 of us worked full-time, flat out with the Climate Council to develop that plan and set forth sort of a different a different sort of framework than we're using now, as Secretary Moore alluded to, in that we did hold the pen a lot more in helping and supporting that. But understanding that that first climate action plan, if it had not been adopted on December 1st, there was an interesting requirement within the GWSA that would have reverted to A&R to meet the objectives of the GWSA through rulemaking. So there was a sort of extra heightened awareness of the Agency of Natural Resources in ensuring that first plan was adopted, understanding that we all supported and worked towards having much more incentive-based, policy-based, robust plan that addressed multiple objectives of getting the work done. So the GWSA passed in September of 2020. The Climate Council met for its first time in November of 2020. Again, 15 legislative appointments, 8 administration officials. The subcommittees, of which 4 were articulated in law, the just transitions, rural resilience, cross-sector mitigation, and ag and ecosystems, first met in February of 2021, and that took significant effort standing up those bodies, in large part because there was an effort to diversify, bring in broader suite of voices, statewide voices, to represent really what would be the inception of the recommendations, to build up the recommendations for the Climate Council to then consider and adopt in the initial plan in December. The GWSA also left broad authority to the council to stand up any other subcommittees necessary to do the work. There was an additional 5th subcommittee, the Science and Data Subcommittee stood up in service of the scientific underpinning data, technical research needs for the Climate Council to do their work. The plan was adopted in real time. We were like sitting on a public meeting, editing, wordsmithing, picking apart that plan on December 1st. And then going forward, there was a shift within the GWSA that the plan would be adopted every 4 years on July 1st. I've actually really wondered about sort of the wisdom of shifting the date. But it's an interesting thing to develop a plan while the legislature is also working on climate policies. So it makes it instead of like a handoff on December 1st, it's like writing a plan while things are in development. So it's different this time, but this first plan is coming faster, 3.5 years, because of the date shift to July 1st. And a large part, those plans are adopted early and faster in service of those initial emission reduction requirements, which I'll speak to in a minute. But those come sort of fast between now and 2030, which is on the next slide. So the Global Warming Solutions Act has 7 statutory objectives of the work around climate action. Largely what is held up are the emissions reductions requirements, but the law does strive to address comprehensive climate change action, speaking to resilience and adaptation, natural and working lands, and other core components of a necessary transition away from decarbonization of fossil fuels. So the statutory emissions reductions, the first of which was January 1st of 2025. Those are intended to be in line with the Paris Climate Agreement. Those actually in the Paris Climate Agreement, you have till the end of the year of the calendar year, but we have a strict January 1st deadline in the GWSA. So the actual emissions reductions requirements, we have interpreted that as being 2024 and 2029 based on our greenhouse gas inventory. So that first emissions reductions, 26% below 2005 has come and gone. The inventory for that is not finalized for actually 2 years past the calendar date. You have likely seen some discussion in the news about, we use real data around the Vermont, I should say, we use real data for it all, but we use Vermont specific data for the transportation sector and the RCI, the residential, commercial, industrial sector, which are by far our 2 largest sectors of emissions in Vermont. And that data, we have roughly 2 to 3 months after the calendar year closes. But our 3rd largest sector is actually agriculture, and we rely on national data sets from EPA for that, which stalls us being able to publish that inventory for 2 more years. However, the emissions data that we have for transportation and the RCI sector signals that we are slightly over 1% over our target for the 2024 calendar year. We won't officially know that till for 2 years.
RCI, can you tell me what RCI stands for?
Residential, commercial, industrial, so it's how we keep our buildings and homes. And the largest part by far is residential homes, but it also accounts for commercial and industrial.
And where does that data come from?
Tax department,
The tax.
we get all fuel sales from the tax department for that. Not, we get it by fuel type, but not disaggregated by like the regulated entity that's reporting, so we just get fuel sales.
Mhm.
And that's been only a 2 to 3 year transition.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Yeah, it's exhausting.
The other data, namely the data from the EPA that you get, are you concerned about that data
Yes,
actually happening?
we are concerned also about, I'll just say the state inventory tool modules, which are the modules we use for the greenhouse gas inventory. We use those modules to transfer that fuel data to the emissions for each sector. Those get updated annually by the Environmental Protection Agency, and we rely on those EPA tools. They were released in January, the updated tools that we'll use for this coming inventory. But whether or not they continue to be updated, and really, that would be a significant cost to Vermont to actually update those tools and the data in those on our own. Some states, like California, develop their own tools, but we rely heavily on the EPA and then use as much Vermont specific data in those tools. So yes, we did not see a change in those tools being produced during the first Trump administration, but expect things to be different this time, possibly. Secretary Moore, did you have that?
I was just wanted to add, the tax department has collected fuel sales data for a long time, but about 2 years ago, worked with Jane's team and started to break apart fuel. So we used to just get gallons and we couldn't have told you if it was propane versus fuel oil versus gasoline, I believe. Oh no, transportation was tracked separately, but any home heating fuel was not disaggregated. The carbon intensity of those fuels is very different, and so starting to receive this data is important, but we're not quite, I don't think, to the point of having trends over time. And this will tie back into a conversation about the what kind of tracking and reporting makes sense, knowing that the committees discussed that as part of your look at the clean heat standard bill. There is good information available from the tax department, but it may not be completely sufficient, as Jane said. My understanding is the tax department knows who reports what. But it was very concerned about that as confidential business information, and so at least initially, while they're tracking it, has agreed to just report it to us as the gallons sold. That said, prior to 2 years ago, it didn't exist, the different types of fuel. So that's a relatively new and frankly important data set.
Really, and we worked with them very closely to develop an update to the form they used to collect that information, so we have it back. And we get the same data now and worked with the Department of Motor Vehicles longer ago through our participation collaboratively in the TCIP program development. We worked to ensure we would get that same level of data a decade ago from DMV to understand the different fuel types in the transportation space in service of developing a policy to cap and invest around transportation vehicles.
So, and obviously the electric sector, you have the data from emissions for that pretty much in real time.
Yes. That sector is done differently than all of our other sectors in the greenhouse gas inventory. Be happy to dive deeper into the greenhouse gas inventory, but the electricity sector is done on a consumption, what's called a consumption-based inventory. So we don't look at the electricity produced in Vermont, we look at the electricity used in Vermont, so where we're getting it from. So for instance, we sell the biomass electricity out of state, so that's we don't count that in inventory. Nor would we, though, based on the methodology we currently use, because we do not count biogenic emissions in inventory, which has been a subject of debate and discussion, and is part of the rationale around doing the life cycle analysis, where we look at the whole picture from cradle to grave, it's called, of the emissions of any energy pathway, so that even if we're not counting it in the inventory, we're making smart policy decisions that don't put our burden on other states, other provinces, because a lot of our natural gas, for instance, is clean at the burner, but comes from Canada and has emissions associated with extraction.
So you're not. One way to frame this, I suppose, would be like, are you more interested in what is consumed through like ISO New England's portfolio, or is it after the Rex parcel?
It's after the rest.
It's after the Rex, okay,
Yeah.
that's all.
And
Those
just
are
a reminder about the Affordable Heat Act, the Affordable Heat Act, one of the components of it required ANR to do an annual life cycle emissions analysis. That was something that was spoken to as a interest in the Global Warming Solutions Act, but we were not obligated to do it annually. The Affordable Heat Act has obligated us to produce a supplemental life cycle analysis with our greenhouse gas inventory every year.
So thank you. You mentioned that you don't count biogenic fuel. So can you talk a little bit more about that? What do you mean?
Yeah, so actually in the initial, for the development of the initial climate action plan, we did a lot of technical analyses, but one of those was to review the methodology of our greenhouse gas inventory. The greenhouse gas inventory in Vermont was developed and started in 2007. Vermont was a leader in sort of developing our initial state-specific inventory. Many states to this day don't have state inventories. They rely on downscaling of EPA data. In fact, actually, of the 24-member US Climate Alliance, only 12 states actually do state inventories to the level that Vermont does. So our inventory is very much a leader in the data, but we're always looking to improve it. And it was not obviously developed to be the backstop of a law, right? So the first thing that we did as part of the development of the initial climate action plan was to develop a methodological review of our inventory to ensure we were doing it as best we can with as best data as we can and in line with how other states do things. We found it at that time it was consistent and our methodology was true. And I mentioned that because at the time, no state was counting biogenic emissions within their inventory. So that is that we don't count when you look at the RCI sector, the residential, commercial, industrial, we do not count wood that is burned in people's home as a heating source. That does not get counted in the gross emissions inventory side of the inventory. And hence why we could spend a lot of time on the inventory. There is another component of the inventory that's not on the gross ledger side that looks at the net emissions. So it does account for the land use sector and the burning of wood and the sequestration and storage of it. But it doesn't get counted because we sort of, we believe in the aspect of burning wood, keeps forest, there's a sequestration and storage component. There are rationale, but it is not counted for. So our inventory, and Vermont and Maine are probably the only two states that would have significant increases in our emissions if you were to count wood.
Yeah,
Because it's such a large component
I
of home
mean, we're
heating.
being imported right now by what,
Yes.
in this way. And one of the major institution in my Senate district is heated by wood.
Yeah, our Pikeman school is heated by wood.
Yeah.
Okay, so
Yeah, I mean, that's so fascinating. I did not know that was included. Yeah, it's interesting.
So just and final thing I'll say about our emissions reductions targets, which I know you have all heard from both administration officials and council members alike, is our emissions reductions are much steeper requirement for 2030, which is actually January 1st, 2030. So the 2029 year requires us to be 40% below 1990 levels. So the baseline year of which we're tracking against changes. And it requires essentially to roughly cut our emissions in half from that 2005, which was our largest year of emissions by 2030. We all agree we are not on track to meet that. And I will actually discuss some of the policy reviews in service of this plan that we've looked at to meet that requirement and the challenges. So just to keep moving, I will acknowledge that the Global Warming Solutions Act required coordination between the Climate Action Plan and the Comprehensive Energy Plan. The undertaking of the initial CAP was done simultaneously to the drafting of the 2022 CEP. So we were very locked and hip, like working on the two plans together. There is a lot of overlap of requirements between the CEP and the CAP, but there are also distinct requirements of the CEP and the climate action plan. And so just acknowledge that this update to the climate action plan is not timed or synced with the CEP. So we're trying to do a more comprehensive look at how the CAP speaks to and incorporates other plans, namely one that is really important for resilience and adaptation, the state hazard mitigation plan. And so we're sort of looking at sort of how they're in line, how they differ between these two plans in order to address that in this update. So I'm gonna move kind of quickly through this, but I do want to articulate before I move into what is in the initial climate action plan that the Global Warming Solutions Act actually spells out how the climate action plan will address specific initiatives, programs, and strategies. And in some of the ways associated with these, what are 8, 2 slides, objectives, we have done an exceptional job, I think, through the Climate Council's work and the administration. And in other areas, there has been more of a challenge on how we define this and really address this thoughtfully. So there's the first priority around prioritization of the most cost-effective, technologically feasible and equitable greenhouse gas emissions reductions. That term cost-effective has been challenging to say the least about how we address it, what it means to us as a climate council, how you account for that. We've done that both through application of the social cost of carbon in our analysis, which looks at the long-term benefit to society around making these emissions reductions, but how you define who pays and the actual upfront cost has been challenging for the council to grapple with. I will talk to the prioritization method that we've used for recommendations on another slide that'll get at how we strive to at least incorporate it. We have thought about the relative contribution of the sectors that contribute to emissions. The Global Warming Solutions Act speaks to this, and the council adopted a policy around proportional reductions, in understanding that no one sector will sort of carry the weight of the GWSA emissions requirements on its own. However, in the end, the number that we're looking at is just the overall greenhouse gas emissions inventory. So if 10 years from now, it turns out that it's a lot more cost effective and easy to decarbonize the transportation sector, we might shift the way the policy is written by the council to sort of carry more emissions by transportation. But right now, we're looking at proportional reduction and striving to write policies that proportionally meet that. That was very true in the passage of the Affordable Heat Act and the way the Clean Heat Standard was looking specifically at those proportional reductions for the RCI sector. We're working through the Just Transitions Committee to think about equitable policy that supports the transition for low and moderate income Vermonters, thinking about benefits across the whole state for greenhouse gas emissions, making sure that those benefits are not focused exclusively, for instance, on Chittenden County and how we lift up voices from around the state in our engagement. And beyond that, we're thinking about economic sectors. This climate action plan, I will say, has a much more robust focus on workforce and workforce recommendations to understand not only what new workforce we need, but how we support decarbonization and the sectors that will likely phase out over time.
We have a couple of questions, Senator Hardy, then Senator Beck.
I'm sorry to stop your flow, but I'm wondering, so in my county, we have a group that does like a climate action plan, kind of a similar thing just for Addison County. How much do you work with those kinds of efforts?
I know a lot about that one, mostly because the gentleman who writes that science and data subcommittee.
really?
So, yeah, so he brings that forward quite a bit. Obviously, Richard Hopkins. Yeah, however, I think Addison County is somewhat unique in its.
Yes, we are.
Yeah, exactly. It is the level it has taken to think about a climate action plan. So we do not have a particular focus on scalability of this plan to counties and or towns.
Okay.
But we actually have a different contractual project we're working on right now in the Climate Action Office around the framework for municipal climate action plan, understanding first and foremost how we can support municipalities in using their existing planning frameworks to address climate action. And then if you're like the gold star, like the South Burlington or the Addison County, who wants to actually write your own climate action plan, giving them the tools and resources on how to do that. So that's a project that's actually happening right now out of the Climate Action Office, which is really exciting. We have a municipal advisory committee with reps from all over the state serving on that to help guide that project.
That's very cool, because I think, especially given everything that's going on, a lot of people are like, we need to lean into the local, and it seems like it's a good time to build that up. I have another question, but I'll wait on that. Go ahead.
Gene, you mentioned that you're trying to do this in a way that spreads it out amongst the county's greenhouse gas emissions. Is that because of statute or rule, or is that just a decision that the climate council has made?
Well, I should say that we're trying to make sure the opportunity to be part of the transition. We're not like only focused on if you were to focus on Chittenden County, for instance, you'd likely see a lot of emissions benefits and maybe opportunities at scale. But we obviously want to make sure that we're providing opportunities to participate in the transition statewide and thinking about how those are equitably distributed so that those resources are not only going to the areas.
Okay, so it's distribution of opportunity. Okay, great. I mean, it's me, I personally, it's just one atmosphere and it doesn't matter whether those greenhouse gas emissions come from Wyndham or Chittenden or anything. So there might be more bang for the buck if you do these projects in certain areas of the state, so.
If I may, I think the challenge and one of the things we're trying to balance, is there may be lower hanging fruit in some ways in places like Chittenden County around public transit or around with Vermont gas system and the number of homes in the Chittenden and Addison County area that are connected to that gas system that don't exist in other corners. And so trying to ensure that as we're looking at just both the policies themselves, but then the necessary supports for their implementation, we're not unintentionally biased to what may be some of the easier gets, and then have the costs associated with the work really sit more heavily on our rural communities. And so it's a balance of trying to be as cost effective as possible, but not having the practical effect be costs are much less felt in our more densely populated area, or much less felt in our densely populated areas.
The final two comments I'll just make on these components are just the investment in natural solutions and sequestration and storage. What I might have glossed over in the objective slide for the GWSAs, we are required to be net zero by 2050. That is something that we, if given testimony on H289, our office and the agency would like to see a stronger emphasis on the net target focus. Right now, the way the emissions reductions requirements work, we're required to reduce our overall gross emissions by 80% by 2050, which essentially, and in simplest terms, would allow us to lose the sequestration and storage value significantly of our natural and working lands and still be net zero. We would like to see something lifted up where we're thinking about how we both manage the benefits of natural and working lands and the sequestration and storage of it, as we're also cutting our climate pollution and marrying those two objectives for the benefits they both provide. And that's part of 289 and something we'd be happy to talk about in greater detail about how we account for that currently right now, that sequestration and storage, and then the gross emissions reductions, we would still be required to get through the net target that's being proposed.
Since we're talking about it, if I can ask you about that, how does that relate to the IPCC report and the emission reductions that we need in order to stay? Do you know what I mean? Like, is there?
Yes.
Yeah.
We would still, in order to be net zero by 2035, we would still need to cut our emissions more than in half from 2005 levels, which is essentially pushing out the 2030 target about 4 or 5 years. However, it's also requiring us to stop the loss of natural and working lands So the IPCC actually is interpreted as a net target. And the way the US Climate Alliance and the US determines our nationally determined contribution to the Paris Climate Agreement, of which we are no longer part of, but the Biden administration put forward before the transition occurred. They put forward net target emissions as part of that. So this is actually coming in line with the way the federal government looks at net target emissions, as well as our membership in the US Climate Alliance. So it's something we'd be happy to talk about more. And there is, I think there's often comments made about our ability to track sequestration and storage and how reliable that data is. And that's certainly something we can talk about, and how we can improve upon that. But I often think it's also said that our gross emissions are like fact. That is also an estimate, and there are challenges with how we estimate our gross emissions, right? Are they easier and more static? Yes, but it's still an estimate of our gross emissions. And so it'd be interesting to look at and discuss the ability of a net target and what better data we might need to feel confident that we're still also really equaling out the ledger. But I just really like the explanation in my mind of like, it's like a checkbook, you don't spend more than you have. And it's also for us, our greatest contribution in my mind to climate change action is our natural and working lands and our forests and our ag lands. And right now, those goals, our 30 by 30 goals, our 50 by 50 goals, are essentially at odds with our emissions reductions. And that target marries those and allows us to think thoughtfully about how we put those two things together. Yes, Dave.
Yeah, I was actually just gonna, when you were talking, I was thinking about the 30 by 30, 50 by 50. Right now, you think they're at odds?
I think that I shouldn't say at odds, I should just say we're a state with limited resources and capacity, and it would actually intentionally marry. So it's not at odds.
Because that's what I was thinking before you mentioned them. I was like, oh, it seems like that would be really consistent with what we were trying to do, or
Thank you for
with, I also, you mentioned the federal level. I know it's too early to really understand what the heck's going on there, but it's not good, especially in relation to climate. Have you been tracking how that, whatever happens at the federal level, will deter our ability to meet, even come close to the goals?
Yes.
Or the targets?
We, as a member of the US Climate Alliance, Governor Scott was one of the first governors to sign on to that in 2017. That alliance was set up to fight back against the Trump administration. It's currently 24 states, of which we're the only Republican state right now at the table. But those states are working collaboratively to still meet the nationally determined commitment by President Biden. And in fact, worked very closely with President Biden about how he stood that up, understanding the transition, and that really the back of this, the brunt of this work would be felt on states, understanding without federal leadership. So we do our own business as usual modeling, looking at our emissions trajectory as a state, and the Climate Alliance is now updating the modeling based on the federal government's pullback of actions and what we can expect for emissions reductions and scenarios. So it's, yes, we are working closely. Do I think it was a little bit harder? Yes, but I think that we knew it was coming, and the way the emissions reductions were set for the 2035 NDC to the Paris Climate Agreement, it was with the Trump administration in mind.
So, I mean, I'm thinking, you know, way more about this than me, so you're much more. I'm thinking more on this basic level of the Infrastructure Act, whatever it's called, the.
What IIJA.
Yes, that one, that provides a lot of money for climate and infrastructure projects like geothermal and things like that.
Electric
Vehicles, they're pulling all of that back, so. I mean, there are just a lot of things that I think probably we had planned as part of all of this that are no longer gonna be able to happen.
Yes.
And yeah.
Yeah, I mean, revenue is a challenge for climate action. So we are updating, as Secretary Moore alluded to, we have the Stockholm Environment Institute. We're working, and right now to update our business as usual model in concert, in collaboration with the Climate Council as the baseline to see what our current policies, what the current federal funding landscape, our current policies, what trajectory we're on between now and 2030, and what gap we need to close through policy intervention or new revenue sources. And so the last time we updated that model was in 2023, and it accounted for the Inflation Reduction Act, the bipartisan infrastructure bill, and we're now having to scale back a lot of the ambition that was in that model based on the rollback of those ones.
Can I just add one point?
Sure, and then we have a question from.
Sure.
Yeah.
Perspective, the state is making really significant investments in climate action. Jane's team documented as part of the report we submitted to the legislature back in January, about $100 million of state investments in greenhouse gas emissions reductions and resilience work this year alone. The flip side to that is the total investment we are anticipating was about $500 million, and the other 400 million was federal funding. So I do think revenue is gonna be a challenge. I can't foresee a way that Vermont can fill the gap created by the federal government. But it's not an all or nothing proposition. There really is significant state-led investments that are being made sort of as a matter of course. And we hope those will continue regardless of what happens at the federal level.
Yeah, I wasn't saying that we weren't gonna do this, keep going, but just so much of it is dependent on federal grants that it's really sad, to say the least.
Yeah, for sure, send her back.
So Jane, to these, well, I think of this as, it's a glide slope. We're trying to get on the glide slope and stay on the glide slope. When establishing that glide slope, is there any factor in there for, and I know this would be speculative, hypothetical, but better technology down the road. A more efficient heat pump that we don't have now, but we look at the history of heat pumps and how they become more efficient, and the next generation will probably be better than the ones we have now. Does that factor in, or do we wait until that technology is there and then we adjust? How does that factor in?
I think electric vehicles are the best analogy I can think of in our modeling. Pretty much all of our modeling around electric vehicles, in large part because of regulations such as advanced clean cars that are intended to be transforming mechanisms, technology transforming mechanisms, should really show that with sort of little further investment, the peak with electric vehicles is really just beyond 2030. So as you can imagine, between next year, our regulations for advanced clean cars 2 go into effect. That delivery rate of electric vehicles to Vermont jumps from 11% to 35%. Whether of overall light duty vehicles being delivered, I should just say there's a lot of caveats with that number around like compliance credits, et cetera. It won't necessarily jump like that. However, that ramp up rate really shows just a kind of full transition to electric vehicles beyond 2030. So 2032, 2033, that transition just hits, right? And then for us with those regulations, 2035 is obviously no longer have new internal combustion engine vehicles delivered to Vermont. That said, we take into account all forecasts, technology models and understanding when we develop our business as usual model. So those intricacies of technology forcing change or what's on the horizon all gets factored into our modeling to the best of our ability to understand where and when different technologies will hit. I want to acknowledge the time.
Yes, and I know you have quite a few more slides to go. This has been very interesting and so important, and so I'd love to find a time to have you back to finish these slides. Knowing that we do have other witnesses on deck here, so we'll put a pin in it for now and come back to this important conversation of fabulous.
Yeah,
Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me, and I'll just acknowledge a lot of what in my slides you'll find there's lots of links, and what I tried to do for you all was put in one place like the reports we do annually to the legislature, which does summarize a lot of the progress from the climate action plan, links to the federal spending reports and things that are all put together. So look forward to coming back.
So,
Thank you very much for your lunch.
Yeah, I'd love to have you back, it's just saying, it's really interesting.
Thank you so much.
So,
Yeah. Super. Thank you. All right, you as well. All right, and so we are switching gears now, talking about CAFOs and stormwater discharges, and we are joined by a couple of farmers today. So we have Mr. Kemp online with us. Welcome.
Thank you, and appreciate the opportunity here to speak in front of this committee. I am a farmer down here in Addison and Rutland County. Our farm encompasses almost 2,000 acres, and we lease an additional 1,000 acres. Current name of the farm, we were beef for over 18 years, and now we've converted to a dairy heifer replacement for a farm that has purchased what used to be Mountain Meadows Farm. So myself and staff are staying on, and we're switching gears. But this water quality has been in the forefront of our ag practices for the last, 20 years that I've been here. And we were very much involved during Act 64 to helping develop the RAPs, and this current scenario with the EPA making requirements onto Vermont's water quality is very important to us. And I just want to take the opportunity to speak on behalf of Senate Bill 124 in my support for that bill. I believe this bill gives us a path to develop a water quality plan that should be hopefully accepted by the EPA. It gives us the opportunity as farmers to be in the stakeholder process through the rulemaking, which we were again and with the RAPs, and we really want to be again moving forward as things change. We want clarity, and we think that this bill and the working group will allow that to happen. And it seems to have the language that I think that the EPA and others think that will satisfy their requests. And I know it has support from the Ag Agency, the Agency of Natural Resources, and even the governor. So that's why I'm here today to just speak in favor of that, and I hope that this bill can get moved forward. And just to also reiterate that farmers have been part of the solution through this whole process. The EPA themselves have told us for several years now that we're responsible for over 90% of the phosphorus reduction that has taken place. And I think that's critical for everyone to keep in mind. And we have embraced Act 64 over the last however many years it's been now, and farmers have gone above and beyond to help improve the water quality of the states. And with that, I guess I just want to be, to the point. I'll take questions if you have any, but I think it's just critical that we move in the right direction on this and try to satisfy the EPA, but also be able to have what realistic goals and during this process and allow farms to, stay in compliance and yet have, regulatory, acceptance and understanding from the community.
Great, thank you so much. Any questions for Mr. Kemp? I have a question. Just in terms of water not being discharged off of a farm, and I feel like I have a picture of what that might look like, but I don't really know, and I would love to just confirm, like, what, does that look like walls? Does it look like covering stuff? Like, what does that, as a practical matter, like, look like for you?
Are you referencing like the barn sites, the home, the farmstead sites or fields? I mean, because
I think either.
we're trying to control both, and
Okay.
like on the farmstead sites, it's practices like leachate programs from the feed bunks to catch that. If there's outdoor yards, it's having that water be either contained or going into a manure pit or something, which makes challenges. The more water we put into these lagoons, adds to the trouble of having enough winter storage. We're mandated to have 180 days of storage, and if we get these rains that we've had in the last few years of dumpings of 3 to 6 inches at a time, that really impacts the amount. So on our farm, we were looking at projects of putting on eaves troughs off the barns, water roofs to collect that and divert that out clean before it gets to the yards in the concrete. And then on the fields, it's the buffers and having buffers where we're not spreading manure away from the ditches and the streams, and grass waterways where water channels through the fields, keeping the manure out of those, keeping them grassed over so that we're not having soil loss. So a lot of those, have been going on and need to continue for sure. And as we move along, there may be other good practices that we haven't thought of. But I'm here to say that farmers have embraced it and are doing these projects, and they are costly. And we've been lucky to have the funding we've had in the past and need to continue to be able to access that funding as we move forward.
Yeah, great. And then I also would love to ask about, so it sounds like you were involved in the development of the RIPs with Act 64. So there was a stakeholder process along with that. Could you just tell us a little bit about what that entailed and how that went?
Uh, I honestly don't remember a stakeholder process other than that we were at all the public hearings and had input on that. I can't remember honestly if there was an actual working group like what we're proposing for this. I think this is a little bit better organized at this point because farmers have been working together with the farmer watershed groups around the state. So I think we're a little further ahead now in that concept of having a unified voice across the state, in this working group that's being proposed. And I believe is developed, and I think their first meeting's April 1st, I believe, and it'll be a couple members from each of the farmer watershed groups. And I think that's key. And if this bill goes through, I think there's language in that to, about this working group. So I feel that's important.
Great, thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Kemp?
Thanks,
Okay.
Brian.
Thanks so much.
Thank you for the opportunity and your
Yeah.
consideration.
Absolutely. All right, so we're gonna move to Ms. Pope, was also with us online.
Good morning.
Good morning, welcome.
Can you hear me okay?
Yes, we can.
Perfect. Thank you for hearing from us today, and thank you, Senator Hardy, for the introduction of S100. My name is Stephanie Pope, and I'm a third generation dairy farmer with the fourth currently working in, and we are an MFO, which is medium farm operation on the shores of Lake Champlain in Bridport, which is in Addison County. We farm about 2,000 acres, and On our farm, we have partnered with the Vermont Land Trust and the CREP programs to conserve our land and the waterways. And we follow, obviously, the RAPs, but we also implement many conservation practices, including no-till and reduced-till practice, manure injection, and cover cropping. One of the things that we like about S100 is it provides predictability in the regulation as a guide going forward. Obviously, predictability is something we value because on so many things, predictability is not always, with being weather dependent, it's not always achievable. So with these bills, the regulation predictability is taken out for us. We appreciate the language and the efforts of the Agency of Ag and the ANR on this bill, and we hope to be a voice going forward and kind of partnering with them to make the language work for everybody. With boots on the ground, no pun intended, it is important for us to have a voice in this. We are all on the same page. We all want clean water. And as stewards of the land, we are the caretakers of the land. So ultimately, I believe that it falls on us to implement. And if we're part of these discussions, I think it just goes a lot further and it's more feasible to get the language and the rules that, work for everybody. So keeping the communication between farmers and the agencies involved is key. And also keeping the regulating bodies in the state, it just seems like a real, it would just be more successful if we could all work as one team and achieve the same goal we all want to achieve, which is water quality. With that, I think I've said this, but we also support S124 as written and would appreciate support on this bill as well. We appreciate you hearing from us, farmers who are directly impacted by these bills. And with the support of these bills, I really feel like Vermont agriculture can thrive in the current environment going forward. So thank you for all your service. And that's all I have.
All right, thank you. And any questions for Ms. Pope? I guess I do have a question. I want to make sure that I'm understanding like the main reasons why you are supportive. It provides predictability, has the stakeholder process, and meets the requirements of the EPA's ask. Is that sort of the
Yeah, that's exactly, and I will piggyback back on Brian, with the stakeholder, that is huge because I felt like with the RAPs, we always, like we were the public, but it didn't feel like we had as much a voice. And I hope that with these bills, it seems like it's a kind of like a collaborative effort with the agencies and farmers alike, all sitting at one table. And that is really, I think, beneficial for everybody.
Great. Super. Further questions?
No
Oh,
question,
okay.
just thanks to both of you for coming, and it's actually been, your testiment's been short, it's been informative, so thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah,
Thanks,
thank you so
Stephanie.
much.
Take care.
All right, see you. All right. So we are running a little ahead of schedule, which is great. So we also have Mr. Carpenter joining us. Election Plan Committee.
Good morning, Madam Chair, and morning committee. We've just got some notes.
Do you have slides?
I don't, they're just, I'm sorry, I got a power meeting tomorrow for 3 acre, but I don't know. So, well, we have discussed this a fair amount, so I've got, I have some notes here, but, so for the record, Jared Carpenter, Lake Champlain Committee. I think we sort of have two main points, and I can go as much, Madam Chair, in depth as you want me to go into aspects of the bill, I can. I'll be referencing more to it's 124 than S100, since that's sort of where everything has been poured into at the moment. And of course, H-146 is, a related, of course, bill, that is currently in the House Environmental. There is no Senate companion. They both address the same issue, just, H-146, we believe more thoroughly, than S-124. One thing is we hesitate for a number of reasons on moving a full bill right now. That's not to say we shouldn't move some aspects, so A&R can start the process. But this is a complicated issue. It's a very important area on Vermont water quality. And we think it should take some, fairly deliberative discussion, not only by this body, but then of course by the one upstairs. To sort of go through exactly the details and how it will be implemented. Also, A&R proposed corrective action plan is still under discussion with EPA and A&R. So EPA, A&R filed their, let's see, it was last fall, A&R filed their corrected plan. EPA came back with comments in December, and last week, March 18th, A&R responded to EPA's comments. We haven't heard back from EPA yet. So this is still a bit of a back and forth between the federal government and the agencies on exactly what is, what they would consider a good corrective action plan. But that's not to say that this shouldn't start. It's going to be a bit of a process. It's going to take a couple of years. But to provide for a fuller legislative discussion, but still allow A&R to begin its permitting and inspection program, we suggest moving a few technical pieces, but not the full bill. This would include, well, 3 parts here, and then of course, there's some budget aspects, but include the state definition of waters to help define the scope of when the permit is needed. As you recall, in the bill S-124, there's a state definition at one point, and there's a federal definition in another. We believe the state definition is better because it's more encompassing than the federal definition. There's a question as to whether or not, as the second part, there's a question as to whether or not A&R has a statutory authority to go on the farm to conduct inspections. I think to be safe, it would probably be a good idea to literally include a sentence or two that says, that there's already language under Title VI for AFM to do so, but to give A&R specific inspection jurisdiction. I think establishing a working group that has been discussed here is really important. There has been over the last, since Act 64, which is the Vermont Clean Water Act that passed in 2015, there has been a lot of opportunities for farmers to engage and discuss this issue. That has to continue. I think if the working group started this summer into the fall, they could provide some preliminary suggestions going into the spring, winter, late winter, early winter, I guess you would say, for next session, to add to the discussion in this body. I think that would be important to get their input, farmer input on this, and others as well. I mean, this is an important issue. It directly impacts them, and rather than passing something and then having a working group that goes on afterwards, it seems to make more sense to have the working group influence the discussion in this body than afterwards. That makes sense. And then finally, it is something in budget. If you recall, A&R has asked for $850,000 for the CAFO database and consulting, and has also asked for baseline funding of $300,000 for 2 FTEs to work on this program. That is in the House budget that is coming over here. So that is an important piece as well that will help A&R sort of start getting the program off the ground. It's going to take them a couple of years to do so. So this is something that A&R can get started. This body can continue discussion of S-124 and H-146 and then come back with that input. So those would be the factors that help the discussion. I'll pause to take a breath, and then I wanted to reflect on some comments on S-124 specifically.
Any questions at this point? I will have questions, but I'm gonna hold off.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So our biggest concern with S-124 is it continues this dual jurisdiction system. And this has been an issue all the way along, where A&R and AFM sort of split the jurisdiction of farmer inspection and who handles what type of discharge from a farm, be it point source or non-point source runoff. It is that dual jurisdiction that has gotten us to a place where we are now, because enforcement hasn't taken place properly and things aren't being enforced and it's affecting the permitting system. So rather than, rather than making meaningful changes to inspection, permitting, enforcement, S-124 only makes minor adjustments. This could potentially be the 5th MOU between the two agencies. It's not called an MOU, it's now called a DUP, but it's an MOU. I mean, it's an agreement between the two agencies and how they're gonna split jurisdiction. To varying degrees, there was one in 1993, 1997, 2007, and 2017. 2017 being the one that was created in Act 64 and thereafter, and that was a purely political construct between two chairs who wanted to divide the jurisdiction. In that Act 64 is very clear on that there should be CAPOs, there should be CAPO permitting, but it was deferred to the split jurisdiction between the two agencies of one handling one part of a discharge and one handling non-point pollution. The problem is that those two agencies don't agree on what a discharge is. They have two different examples of exactly when that is occurring, and when you're reflecting back and forth between two agencies, it just creates a lot of confusion for the farmers, and that is reflected in everybody, and that is reflected still in the bill. There's still instances in S-124 where if AFM sees a discharge of what they potentially think it might be a discharge, they refer to ANR, and if ANR does not see it else, they refer the farm over to AFM for another type of permit. Conceivably, the way the bill is written, a farm could have to have a CAFO permit and an LFO permit and have to bounce back and forth between the two agencies depending on whether a discharge is seen or not seen. That doesn't to us lend to any type of assurity that what's being done needs to be done and that the problem is being addressed. So it's really the dual jurisdiction of back and forth where they really need to sort of overhaul the system and not just address it around the edges the way S-124 does. At its core, non-point water pollution is still water pollution, and therefore it's ANR's jurisdiction. And once again, this bill is looking to subdelegate ANR's authority over to AAFM, which is something that EPA was fairly specific that shouldn't happen. ANR has authority under the Clean Water Act over water pollution, and not this sort of back and forth. So that is one of our keys. I can get into more specifics, but I think I will stop there and take a breath. H-146, the bill upstairs, much more lifts the enforcement authority and the enforcement program over at AAFM and does deposit it over at ANR, including permitting fees and other things to help run the system, rather than having this dual system of two enforcing bodies and therefore twice the expense. But it's always been something that was, let's discuss where we're going with this, and have a conversation, so we're not back here in 5 more years saying, well, let's do a 6th MOU and we'll tinker with it a little bit more and maybe it'll work this time. So that's where the environmental advocates are coming from on these two bills and on this issue, on an issue that some of these organizations, some of us have been working on for 5 and 6 years now. So this hasn't been something that just sort of happened. In the EPA, took 2 years to do their investigations and come up with their recommendations. So it's something that has been thought out and should continue to be thought out before the changes are made and put in place.
So when you say that this might be like the 5th MOU, do you mean the 5th version of the same kind of agreement?
Yes, so
Okay.
especially the last two, in 2007 and 2017, and sort of, if you look at the language of S-124, it goes back and changes the statutory language that was in Act 64 that's now currently in statute, and sort of, well, let's delete MOU and we'll call it a document, and let's cross this off, we'll add this in. At its core, it's the same thing, it's the same dual jurisdiction, it's just shifting things slightly. Where we think in the agency natural resources should have an enforcement body under one permit.
Questions?
And I did bring some friends in here in case I have a lifeline or something, a question that I don't quite understand that they might, so I might.
Yes, good.
So in S-146, and in the EPA's, what the EPA was looking at, they were specifically looking at CAFOs.
Correct.
And the permitting for CAFOs. And this bill does move the permitting and all the authority for CAFOs over to A&R. It makes it very clear that A&R has that authority. And I do believe, I was trying to scroll through and find it. I mean, I do believe there is the authority in the bill for A&R to inspect, but if that's not clear, that's definitely something we should put
I
in
wasn't
there.
100% sure.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure it's there, but we can ask Michael O'Grady about that, but so the order from EPA was very specific to CAFOs, and so that does get all 100% moved over to A&R.
Mhm.
And the document or MOU, and I understand that it is a little squishy, you know, but is about what happens when there is a potential for a discharge related to a CAFO.
Mhm.
And so I do think that is clear. And in the stakeholder process, there is, you know, a little bit more language about, hey, can we or should we have a conversation about all the other regulations? Farms are highly regulated. There's a ton of regulations on farms. And there are a lot of people at the Agency of Agriculture that are used to working with farmers and helping them meet those regulations. And some of the regulations for farms don't actually have anything to do with water. They have things to do with other things of, you know, soil and, you know, crop management and
Flies and odors, all sorts
lots,
of
a
things.
whole bunch of
Yeah,
things.
so absolutely.
So, you know, I think that 146 does fully move the CAFO, which was the point of the EPA order. And
You mean-
the CAFO regulation from AAFM to A&R. And also leaves open the conversation of what maybe next steps could be. And, you know, is there a way to make things more clear in the future, but wholly taking everything that farm regulations and putting it over into A&R all at once would be a massive upheaval for farmers and what they're used to in terms of their regulatory landscape.
It would be an undertaking. A couple of things. One, we always envisioned for, in terms of the technical aspects of the implementation of the RAPs and other regulations, that would stay at AFM. Because that's where they have the engineers, they have the expertise,
I
so.
don't think 146 or 146 in the House.
House is
The
146.
H bill
140.
moves everything, including the RAPs.
It does move the RAPs, but we envisioned that enforcement would move over, but technical assistance and how compliance with the permitting, compliance with the RAPs would stay with AFM. So the engineers, the people that draw down, who can help draw down the federal money. The regulations say, you know, the cow can't be in the stream. The technical expertise is needed to be how to keep the cow out of the stream and to draw down the money so that it's paid for. That would stay with AFM, but the enforcement of the RAPs themselves and the CAFO permitting under H146, I'm using myself, would move over to A&R under that bill. In terms of the CAFOs, it does move the language over, but it's not terribly specific, and this is where I'm gonna get out of my league. 146 is very specific in moving the federal requirements over where the CAFO definition in S124 is not as extensive. The federal definition has to be floor under the Clean Water Act. I don't think that is reflected in S124. There's also specific instances in S124 of when a discharge is found, where, excuse me, in H146, where when a discharge is found, when it's declared needing a CAFO permit, but in the Senate bill, it is much more discretionary upon the secretary to determine if a discharge is occurring. When in our minds, this is also something that's very much mapped out of the Clean Water Act. So a lot of that language that defines the CAFO and everything is literally the federal language. For the most part, there's another provision or two, but this federal language is lifted and put in, and that has to be the permitting that is not in S124 that should be in the definition. We don't want to do it's 400 pages. It's the federal definition, it's the federal requirements for a CAFO permit. That's a lot. But under the Clean Water Act, there should be a floor of exactly how far permitting goes. We don't think that's in the Senate bill.
Well, I think that I think a lot of the details that are required under the federal CAFO program would be done in rulemaking. They're not something that needs to be in statute.
Right.
What is in statute or what would be in statute if 124 passes is the basics for how to meet the EPA requirements and the federal requirements for CAFOs. And then there, A&R has rulemaking authority to get to the details. We don't want it. You don't want to put all of that level of detail in statute, that's rule. That's the reason why.
I know there's a difference of opinion on that, that there should be very prescriptive guidelines and exactly what is required. For example, in the RAPS, in Act 64 is 4 or 5 pages, including 11 criteria that says, the manure stacking has to be 100 feet away, you have to keep the cows out of the stream. It's very specific. And then it went to rulemaking and it was boiled down even further about how wide the buffer should be. Okay, Act 64 says there should be a buffer. But then during rulemaking was decided that the buffer needs to be 25 feet and not 50, and exactly what the buffer can consist of. So we would maintain that the federal standards before should be put into statute as the guidance for the rulemaking process, rather than just saying, go create a CAFO. And then you decide, it's just, I guess it's a difference of opinion and process.
I guess I just don't understand what you think is missing, because you haven't provided specific language, so,
I can. If
I
I come back next week, I can certainly come in and we can walk through specific language of what we think should be in the CAFO requirement and other sections. I mean, I'm willing, but that's the committee's discretion.
Well,
timeline is a little.
yeah, what I'm gonna jump to a different question here. How much overlap do you see between yours and the folks that you're working with? What is the overlap in the vision between what you all have in mind and what what A&R has in mind? Or the administration?
I mean, I think obviously there is some overlap in getting the goal. I'm not sure how much flexibility the agencies have. Even if we went into discussions on this, could the agency meet us halfway beyond S-124? I don't know. That's a question for the agencies. We're always willing, of course, I've said this to all of you before, we're willing to discuss, but there's some things that we would like to stick to. But we're more willing to sit down and have a discussion about exactly can we come to an agreement on a sort of a middle ground that works for everybody. That's an agency question.
Well, and just to put up the vision of how I'm picturing this going is like, I wanna know what that, what the set of agreed upon things is, and I know that it won't be everything. But let's figure out what those pieces are, and we can start with, at the very least, agreed upon things, and then work out what this group wants to do with the parts where there's disagreement, and then we can hopefully move forward. That's how I would love to see this go.
Completely understood, but as Senator Hardy alluded to, I mean, it's gonna be. From our end, it likely won't be a tweak here and a tweak there. We would want to see some more substantive changes. So, but let's have the discussion. If we hit a brick wall, we hit a brick wall.
Yeah, and also the timing.
The timing,
Yeah.
and frankly, like the long-term timing that the EPA is not going to be the same EPA at the table, and I think that moving forward with something now is really important, that the EPA will not be a partner.
I am loath to predict exactly how the EPA is going to be in any amount of time, but and having sat in these conversations with the folks for several months, haste was not one of the things that I got a sense from them that they wanted to see, but maybe that has changed with the new. I understand your point, Senator, but I can't base decision on what the EPA may or may not be in 6, 10, 12 months. I mean, it might not exist at all. I have no idea.
Well, and to say it out loud, I mean, the acknowledging that this may be an iterative process and we may not get it, well, especially if we have a stakeholder process, like we want to know what the results are from that. And so I want to make sure that that we come, if we're gonna have a stakeholder process, that in my mind actually guarantees that we have to come back. Anyway, I just wanted,
But that begs it, if we're gonna pass a bill now to go through the stakeholder process, the APA changes everything, the stakeholders wanna change things that are already in there, are we coming back and redoing the bill a second time next year after having passed something out? Versus, you see where I'm going?
Yeah.
But what the bill does right now is there is no CAFO program right now. So this would create a CAFO program, it would allow A&R it would give them the authority to go inspect farms and start having a CAFO program. It would give clarity to the farmers. And farms would actually literally be inspected this year under the CAFO program. If we wait to that will delay it even more, there will be less clarity and it will be less good for farmers and less good for water quality. So moving forward with this, even if you don't think it's perfect, it is, I think, an important first step. And then we come back and we can tweak it next year. We're all still gonna maybe be here. So, I think waiting to get this perfect agreement also is not the right.
Understand your point, Senator, but also in a couple of things that I said in the beginning with the technical assistance and, those 3 or 4 points that I had made of.
I wrote them down.
Thank you, rather than the full bill would also allow A&R to start the process and the conversation to come back and continue next.
But it wouldn't give them authority to inspect and have a CAFO permit.
Well, that was part of it, was giving them the authority to start inspections.
But unless we.
It's gonna take them a while to stand up the CAFO.
Exactly, so why not get started now?
wanted to jump back, take a step back. If you have more comments, I don't wanna,
No, I mean, that was, sure.
cause I have more questions, but
I
I do
looked
wanna.
at pages of the bill, but you
Okay.
got my points.
Yeah, no, fair enough,
Sure.
so, I wanna make sure that I understand the points of contention, you know what I mean, like, where is the debate at this point, like, what are the points? And I feel like I'm hearing 3 things, and if other members of the committee or have other things on their radar, like, here's some points of disagreement that you're hearing, fill me in. But one thing is the definition of a discharge, like, how are we defining it, what does that look like, how does that occur? A second thing is there's this discussion about how are we defining waters. A third thing is do we move all of the jurisdiction right now, or do we just move the CAFO permits? Which might mean that someone has to have an LFO and a CAFO permit potentially at the same time. Maybe I'm misinterpreting it, but.
And I might be misinterpreting the bill, but it
Okay.
does seem that there's overlap there.
Okay.
That might cause some confusion of exactly what permit is needed when.
And then. Then it also sounds like the degree to which a CAFO is defined. Now, are we defining it to what level of detail, or how do we reference the definition of the CAFO? Is that?
Those are the basics. I'm gonna look at John and Scott to see if I'm missing anything.
I think with respect to the CAFO definition.
Oh, sorry, can you introduce yourself?
Absolutely. Hi, I'm Scott Sanderson. I am with Conservation Law Foundation. I look after our regional farm and fleet work in attorney. With respect to CAFO definitions, I think one of the important differences between the bills is what the implication of being in CAFO is under the 2 bills. So under S100, it's not entirely clear whether being in CAFO means that you will then need to have a permit, whereas the definitions in S146, the way that they interact with the other provisions of S146, essentially would require NIPD's permits, so Clean Water Act permits, for all large AFOs and for all medium AFOs. And so medium AFOs are equivalents, are the federal equivalents of medium farm operations. So I think what the permitting trigger is one of the major differences. And whether or not you're going to be as a farm going between a state permit and a federal permit, depending on the circumstances, which would be the S100 model, or if you're just going to be under a federal Clean Water Act permit, which is the 146 model. So one permit system versus two permit system.
Okay, any other points? Yes, would you like to introduce yourself?
Definitely, Caroline Sherman, board of the legislative director of Removal Law. One point I see missing is due diligence and farmer participation in changes to regulatory oversight of farms. This committee being an example, we had a couple of farmers here, but doing a more significant shift as advocates propose would need a more due diligent process in farmer participation, including oversight of the ad committees of the bill proposed and the health that have not taken place yet with H146. So the Senate bill is much better in that with proposing at least a stakeholder review process, but also just the proposal to move the whole RAP rule would mean at an administrative level, the oversight of even who defines what farming even is, would shift to an agency that's not representing farmers. So that would basically uproot any agencies farmers have in defining what is farming, their bread and butter. So it's literally a threat to the representation of farmers in the state of Vermont.
Thank you, and thank you for pointing that out. I guess I have been thinking about the stakeholder processes. We have to do that. So I think maybe there's some questions about what that looks like. Sorry. Yes, go ahead.
I think the point that was just made is that if what I'm hearing from Jared and others is, oh, we should move everything over to A&R and do it without a stakeholder process. That's what that H146 does. And this 124 starts by saying, okay, we're going to move the CAFO authority, which is what the EPA wants us to do. And that the definitions of CAFO in this bill are based on the EPA federal definitions. And what we're starting by moving that and having, getting that going and allowing the administrative process to happen, all the work that both agencies have to do, the rulemaking process, literally starting with inspections. And at the same time, having stakeholder group about not only the implementation of the new CAFO stuff, but also a larger discussion about, farm regulations. And I don't think that it precludes further changes down the road, but what it does is it allows farmers to be at the table to talk about their own regulation. And I think that's crucial.
Yeah. Would you introduce yourself for the record? Yes.
I'm John Groveman. I'm the Policy and Water Program Director for the Vermont Natural Resources Council. I've been personally involved with these issues for more than 20 years. Both of the previous MOUs being negotiated and implemented for various purposes, including working at the Agency of Natural Resources. So a couple points I want to make is I think it's important to just be clear, because this is a conference, Jared said. So the Agency of Agriculture does not have now and has never had the authority to issue CAFO permits. We're not moving that authority. The issue has been that the A&R always had that authority, and even if we didn't have anything in our laws under the Clean Water Act, they're required to issue CAFO permits. And the issue with the petition to EPA has been it just never happened. So I don't disagree that we need a system that works. The system we have doesn't work. But I just want to be really clear, like we're not moving that from AFM to A&R. We're basically trying to get the system to work.
Sorry, can you say, what is it you're not moving?
We're not moving the CAFO program from AFM or authority to A&R. They've never had that authority. They don't have that authority. They don't have that program. A&R has that in program implied because they're the delegated authority to implement it. Well, I agree, we need a bill and we need to resolve these issues. That's what the petition is all about. That's the other point I want to make is that, so this was started by the petition that CLF led with Lake Champlain Committee and the NRC. So we're parties to this. So EPA they haven't issued an order. They issued a preliminary decision based on our petition. And so we, as petitioners, have a seat at that table equal to A&R. We're both there, and EPA is trying to get all the parties to agree. Because if we don't get a resolution that EPA we don't that the parties agree with, then you could go to federal court. So this isn't over. Like, just it's not, EPA is a giant player in this, and I think that as petitioners, we've been part of that. EPA has basically recognized the problems that we have raised with farm pollution programs, and at the core of it is, yes, we need permit programs that comply with the Clean Water Act, but the core of the problem that EPA is wrestling with, we've been wrestling with for as long as we've been dealing with farm pollution in the state, is who identifies what a discharge is, and then who has the authority to inspect and then to enforce and require a permit. And so it's not just getting the right words on the page about what's required in that permit. It's about having a system where we don't have agencies disagreeing and things held up and water pollution not being addressed. And our vision has always been, in the discussions with EPA, is, you know, really it's about water. So it's not about everything in the rafts or all the regulations that farms are under. It's that the question that we're all wrestling with is, so who should be responsible in state government in Vermont for going and evaluating all potential discharges and then taking action? Should it be only A&R if it's a CAPO issue, if it's a clear point source discharge under the Clean Water Act? But when there's that gray area, which a lot of this is gray, should it be both agencies? First AFM, and then they talk to A&R, and then if one of the agencies thinks it's non-point source and not point source, well then they don't give it over. But then what happens when they disagree? And that's why we've been talking about a shift only with regard to water. We don't want to shift. We don't want A&R regulating non-environmental issues. But that's been the conundrum with this. So I think the task force is great. You know, we're not opposed to that at all. I'm very supportive of it. Just so that was our focus has been on the problem that I just identified. But I agree, we should have a task force, and we're ultimately going to have a CAPO program that needs to work. But I think we're still wrestling with this dual authority and the confusion, and then the MOUs are continually designed to address it. They just haven't worked. So don't know how EPA is going to come down on this. Obviously, we live in the real world. We know what's happening with the federal government. It's terrible what's happening with the federal government. But we have two federal judges in Vermont that have been appointed by Senator Leahy and I think Senator Welch, and they're good judges. And we're parties to this. So we don't want to have a whole overhaul and then have to come back because either EPA or a federal court says, you know what, you got to shift the whole, this is not sufficient. So I think taking steps this year, as Jared outlined, makes a lot of sense. I think task force makes sense. I think some of the, the definition of water makes sense. The inspection authority makes sense. Funding A&R to get started on some of these issues makes sense. But like, that's what we're not sure where this is going to land. And we just want to end up with a program that works better than it has for the last 25, 30 years.
And what is the best path to
Yeah,
get to a
right.
program that works? Yeah.
So that's kind of our overall sort of view of things.
Super. Any questions? Well, before we go there, any questions from the committee? Okay. Okay. Would you like to add something?
I just had a follow-up comment to the discussion, because Senator Hardy really explained well, I think, that S-124 might as well lead to the A&R's ability to this year go out and inspect farms. And just to address the confusion element that's maybe one of the main sticking points right now in the room. From my perspective, I can't really follow that when, I think that's the A and R, I understand the A and R is that EPA is asking A and R to be proactively able to make their own assessment, what is a discharge and whether a K4 permit is needed or not, and that not to be dependent on an VAFM presence on farms. But if the A and R would go around and inspect every farm once, they could make their assessment, they could, you know, make their discretion work of whether they do need a K4 permit or not. And why not improve the bill to say like after an A and R